Today we are making a corset, which means that it is time to destroy the old one. There can be only one. I've gotten a lot of great use out of this mock-up over the years, but because it was just supposed to be a mock-up, my stitching on the inside is not exactly the neatest. The bright green color that was supposed to be temporary is actually kind of surprisingly hard to wear with clothing, with outfits. And I've just discovered over time little things that I want to change about the pattern, so it is high time that we go ahead and retire this one. Unfortunately, I seem to have misplaced my paper pattern that I used for this corset. Originally, I developed it from a commercial pattern that I then, through a series of mock-ups and changes, I adjusted it until it was exactly what I wanted. So unless I want to go through all of that work again, I think what I'm going to do is cut this one up so that I can trace out all of the individual pieces, and I need to harvest the busk and all the bones anyway, so no matter what, this was its fate. Kind of works out that I'm doing this for today's video because while you might not have a old corset that you need to deconstruct, you might have a favorite pair of old jeans that are on their last legs, or a shirt that's super stained or maybe not fitting as well as it could anymore. You're going to basically do the same process that I'm going to be doing today. If you can, try to seam rip everything with your seam allowances intact rather than cutting them off. If you have to cut your seam allowances away, that's fine. Just make note of it in your paper patterns as you go along, what areas you need to add the seam allowance back on. There are some things where it doesn't really make much of a difference, like a shirt, if it's half an inch bigger or smaller in the sleeves or something, that's probably not going to be a big deal. With corsets though, you really wanted to try and be as precise as you possibly can. So I'm going to try and be slow and careful here and methodically pluck away all of these seams until I get bored and just start ripping it in half. Actually, I think before I get too much farther, I think it would be a good idea to mark what the different pieces are, like number 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, because some of these look surprisingly similar. We want to make sure that they stay in the correct order at the end. If you're feeling fancy, you could also do notches to help make sure that things line up how they're supposed to. And for this one, I think I'm going to aim for like the waist area as my point of alignment. Now we've separated one half of the corset, so it goes from looking like this to this, which admittingly is not as cute, although once I get all of these little loose threads picked up and cleaned off, that's gonna help it look a little bit better. I have now reclaimed my bones and my busk. I do have more of these, but I had to get this guy because I do not have any other busks right now, and I don't want to wait for one. So we have our supplies reclaimed. I also went ahead and kept the lacing cord. It's in really, really good condition considering it's been used a lot for the last couple of years. I probably won't be using this on the final version of this corset because I'm gonna go for a light colored fabric, so I'll want to get a light cord to match, but this will definitely be useful for a future dark corset. Next, once I've finished cleaning all of these pieces up, I'm going to iron everything perfectly flat so that the seam allowances are exactly as they should be. Right now, a lot of them still have little folded edges. Not everything is going to be able to be ironed completely flat back to its original pattern shape, like this one with the grommets in it, but that's fine because that means that once I am done with all of this, I can keep these two grommeted edges and use them on future pattern testing. You can just stitch these pieces on to whatever you're testing with the mock-up, and that way you have a nice, super finished grommeted edge to use for your pattern testing. It's very handy to hold on to these when you get them. Once all my pattern pieces are completely cleaned up and ironed and looking absolutely beautiful, we're going to start transferring them to paper, which I hopefully won't misplace this time. We're going to trace these out. We're going to keep the paper patterns with the rest of the patterns like it should be. And then we'll be able to move on to altering the pattern because after wearing it for a couple of years, there are definitely some little pieces I've noticed that I would like to change. You know, the back is maybe a full inch taller than it needs to be. The side front of the bust kind of here needs to be raised just a smidge, maybe half inch, maybe even an inch. The very center front is just a little too annoyingly high, so I think I'm going to nip this little corner area down a bit. The bust doesn't even go up that high anyway, so it's not actually supporting much. You know, it's kind of funny. It feels like I was just doing this a few months ago, because I was. I basically did this whole same process of copying the corset pattern, modifying it to suit my needs for the project with the whole like black butt cape dress. That's probably why the pattern has gone missing, is that I must have tucked it away somewhere silly whenever I finished up that project. So I'm going to go ahead and finish getting all of these pieces cut out. And then from here, we can kind of proceed as if you're interested in making a corset and you're using this as a video to help you with that, then once all my pieces are cut out and you presumably have cut out your pieces of your corset pattern that you've purchased or developed, whichever, we can start moving in at the same space. Now for fabric, instead of using this beautiful, limey, almost green screen sort of colored fabric, I do have some coutil. It's a super sturdy fabric that is pretty commonly used for corsets, especially modernly, but also historically. And so I'm going to do my strength layer, my base layer out of this, which I purchased 2+ years ago for this corset that I'm basically finally getting around to making it. And then for the decorative outside of the corset, I'm going to use this silk satin. I'm kind of debating if I want to use the proper outside of the fabric, which is this more cream color, or the inside, which is the non-satin side. Fortunately, I don't have to decide that now. I can decide it later. I have cut out all of my strength fabric layers, and now we're going to go for the nice silk fashion layer on top. I have decided to go for the proper outside of the fabric. Now, whenever I'm laying out all of these pieces, I am trying to be very careful about the grain line of each one. For any pattern, there's going to be some sort of grain that you're supposed to follow for how you lay it down. Actually, this is a better piece. So see how this is nice and straight? I haven't marked it because I know what the grain lines are supposed to be, but usually there'll be like a line with an arrow indicating how you want to orient that piece on your fabric. And you shouldn't be just laying it willy-nilly on the pattern. Sometimes you can get away with it, but for something like a corset where you're really depending on the strength of the waist, I try to be extra careful whenever cutting these out, because I am exactly the kind of person who's like, it'll be fine, until it's not. You want to make sure that you're cutting out all of your pieces very precisely if you can. You don't want pieces to be a 1/4 inch bigger here and a 1/4 inch bigger there. Suddenly adds up to an inch extra somewhere in your pattern that you didn't intend for there to be. So for something like this, you're going to want to make sure that you're cutting really, really like precisely as you go along. Now that said, if you're going to do any sort of embellishment on your corset that might eat up extra room, like if you wanted to do cording or some quilting, you might want to actually cut out your pieces a little bit bigger than you think they should be, do your embellishment, and then cut it out again afterward. Speaking of which, I think I am actually going to go ahead and give it a try to do some cording on the bust pieces that are kind of here-ish. So I noticed that there's a lot of these late Victorian corsets that have lines of cording going across the bust, kind of about here, to help kind of keep things filled out and nice and stable. And I think that'd be fun to give it a try. So what I'll end up doing is sewing my very first initial line of stitching across the top. Then I'll scooch in a little string. I think I'm going to use some of this leftover macrame string that I have from a previous project. I'll scooch that in, and then I'll stitch right next to that line with a zipper foot so that it's nice and neat and tidy and close. And I'll just kind of repeat that over and over again until I have a nice inch or maybe 1.5 inch section wide with that decorative cording. And you'll kind of notice that the upper fabric, the fashion fabric, creates these bumps that fill in over the cording, so it's getting used up. The fabric is being eaten into more than the base fabric underneath it. So that's why we cut it a little bit bigger so that we can then trim it away after. So you don't have to do this. There are plenty of examples of corsets without the cording, and there's also lots and lots of other decorative options, but it was really fun to give it a try. Now that I have, I will say it wasn't as bad as I thought. I did have to unpick a couple lines and redo them, but on the whole, not bad for a new technique. I will add a little extra bit of information though and kind of amend my earlier statement. You do of course want that top layer to have more fabric than the one below because it's going to need to kind of gather up with those cords. But you probably should also cut the bottom piece, the back side, generously as well. I feel like that would have made the sewing a bit easier than it was with it being the exact finished size. So, lessons learned. Next up is going to be installing the busk. I'm going to go ahead and go for the bumpy side first. So all I'll do is put this on the fabric and sort of trace around this straight and bumpy edge. And then what I'm going to do is stitch in between on all of these straight lines. And not only am I going to stitch between them, I'm going to make sure to use a very small stitch length. That way it's extra strong. And I'm also going to start and stop each of my stitch lines with a back and forth, kind of like you would for any seam that you're starting and finishing. You kind of go back and over it a couple times as one of your available options. And I'm going to do that in between each of these, which is going to be a pain, but I think it'll make it nice and strong. Then I'll take that fabric over to my ironing board and iron the seam open so that it's nice and crisp. Then I'm going to iron it closed again, but with the right side out. And now I should be able to slip my busk in without too much trouble. Once that's in place, I'm going to stitch the busk permanently in by sewing all around the metal edge of the outside. Again, a zipper foot is going to be really handy here because you can get nice and close to the edge of the busk. I've already stitched this edge and then ironed it back, so now we can just sort of nestle that underneath this first piece. And as best as I can, I'm going to try and line up the front edge, line up the bottom edge. It's going to be tricky because this is actually not perfectly flat, but I'll start at the top and then mark that with a pencil right inside the end of each of these loops, because this is where the eventual second half is going to come up. And then I'm going to take an awl and poke through each of these little holes that I've marked on the edge, and then we're going to be able to kind of wiggle these little edges on the second half of the busk through those holes. And then just like the first side, I'm going to stitch along that outside edge. Now that the busk is all done, we can move on to piece number 2 with the cording. We're going to stitch the foundation layer first, which means that the top silk layer here is going to stay loose. And then we're going to repeat that for the other side. Then iron the seam flat towards the busk edge. Now for the silk layer on top, we're going to fold that down to meet the stitch line and pin it in place. It should just barely be covering the previous seam line, and we're going to top stitch it down in place. For the third piece, we can stitch everything at once by flipping the new pieces over the previous ones, making sure to match up those waistline marks, and then stitch this new seam. And it'll look something like this, kind of finished on the inside, but we still need to flip the outside fabric down and then pin it in place. Flat areas can still be done on the ironing board, but it might be handy at about this point to get out the ironing ham for rounded areas like the bust. And then we're going to top stitch everything down to keep it in place. For the fourth piece, which also has that cording, we're going to have to sew just the strength layer again, and then I'll fold back the shiny top layer to cover up the seam, just like we did before. For the fifth panel, it's going to be stitched all in one again, ironed, top stitched, and then repeat the same for the sixth panel. Lots of pins here is going to really help keep everything aligned as you're sewing and you're getting to these more curvy pieces. For the seventh and final panels, they're going to get stitched with the same sandwiching method as 5 and 6, kind of stitching all the layers at once. But once they're on, we do still need to handle these outside edges because they're still raw and not done yet. So I already have this edge nicely lined up with the pins, and I want to keep that fabric in place by adding a row of pins further back, and then I can remove the front ones at the edge. Now I can flip it over, mark the foundation layer with just a line smidge shorter than the actual seam allowance at the end. So I can fold it back so that that line is just towards the inside of the garment. Finger press it temporarily down and then iron it firmly. The top fashion fabric layer will then get folded to match, and then top stitch everything in place with a super narrow edge stitch at the end here. Now that all of my mini panels are assembled and together, next up is going to be lots and lots of bones. I'm also going to add a little bit of a waist stay to the waist, since that's the area on a corset that tends to be under the most pressure. This will help reinforce it. Anytime I do a project that involves boning, I like to do these little samplers so I can test that the channels I make are going to be big enough for the bones I use. I'm actually using 3 different varieties of bone width for this project just because that's what I have on hand and I want to use up. So it's also really nice to be able to verify that the thread that you've chosen looks good on the fabric. You can adjust your stitch length or your tension on your machine, do whatever you need to make sure that it looks really good on the fabric that you've selected. And then you can stitch on your actual project worry-free. For sewing all of my boning channels, I really love being able to use the width of my sewing machine foot if at all possible. And this is why it's important to do little tests, because your different feet are going to be slightly different widths. You can also adjust where the needle is depending on your sewing machine, and that'll help you really kind of customize that boning channel to your specific boning and make sure that it fits beautifully. What's nice is as you sew each of those boning channels, it also goes through the waist stay. So it gets kind of really nicely integrated into the corset as you stitch all those in. Corsets can have lots and lots of different boning channel patterns where they follow the seam or they don't. Some of them use additional boning casing channels to completely not follow the pattern of the sort of corset panels. You have lots of different options depending on the look you're going for. I like the ones that have relatively narrow boning channels with fairly thin boning in each one. So I'm going to be using a lot of these kind of thinner ones that I have and making lots of little rows of boning channels for them to sit in. Then for the very back, I'm going to need to do my thickest one, which I just use like zip tie boning, and I'll make sure that that channel is wide enough for that big bone, leave enough space for grommets, and then another big bone. That way that back area is kind of nice and reinforced. Now before I insert all of the boning, while the corset's still nice and soft, I'm gonna also add the grommets, which I did some more little tests on one of my samplers here, which, good thing, I'm very glad, because it's been a while since I've done grommets, and usually when I've done them before, it's been on very, very sturdy fabric. The surface of this corset is a little bit more on the delicate side, you know, kind of silk satin. So I realized that if I'm a little too aggressive with pounding in the little grommet, it just cuts through the silk, like the edge of the thing. So I need to kind of make sure that I'm a little bit more careful, a little bit more light with my grommeting touch. I did several here that seemed just fine now that I know to be a little bit more light-handed. Now for determining my lacing hole spacing, I like to do around an inch or so between each hole, although sometimes if that doesn't perfectly evenly work along the length of a corset, then I'll toss extra holes nearer the waist, just a little bit closer together, since that area needs a little bit more support and structure anyways. So I have this very handy lacing hole guide that was given to me by Costuming Drama a few years ago, which is kind of nice. It has little holes set with 1 inch, 3/4, half an inch, fantastic. But if you don't have something like that, a good old ruler will do just fine too. This morning I finished off the last of the grommets, so I was able to start adding in some of the bones. So I have used up most of what I could from the old corset that I salvaged, and what I have now, I still have at least half a dozen on each side to do still. So I'm gonna have to start cutting into my roll of kind of thin synthetic boning. To get each of the bones to fit into the channel that I've selected for them, I trim away any excess with the scissors here that I got from a patron, specifically because they saw me struggling with cutting bones previously with my old IKEA scissors. So these are actually pretty dang handy. I'll try to link to them below, but I think that any kitchen shear, really sturdy scissors should work pretty good. I like the roundy bit here. It cuts really nicely. So to help smooth down the really sharp edges that are left from the scissors, I like to use a plain old nail file, and I just file away until I have a nicely rounded edge which can go in the fabric and for the most part doesn't rub away the fabric as badly as it would be if I didn't do that. I am making sure to cut all of my bones so that I have a good, maybe not a full inch before the edge, but almost. You know, you want a healthy bit of distance from the edge of the corset, and then if you want to, you can sort of stitch down the edges. There's lots and lots of Victorian examples of corsets with flossing to help keep the bones really in place, but there's also a lot where they don't. They just let them hang out in there. But generally they're not pushing all the way up on the edge of the corset. So most of my boning channels end either at the top or the bottom of the corset, but there are sometimes funny little channels that kind of start somewhere in the middle. And rather than just snip this off here and possibly have the threads kind of, you know, whisper their way out, we are just going to take this, toss it into a little needle, and then hide the end of our thread inside the channel itself. That makes it so that both on the inside and the outside, that thread there isn't, you know, making a mess. And now we can safely just trim that away. Now that we're fully done inserting all of the bones for the corset, it's time to work on this lacing, which on the old corset, I had the cord, it was about 200 inches, and that worked really, really well. For this one, I want to do a color that matches, so I went ahead and cut a 200-inch long cord, and now we're going to lace it in. So here is our halfway point, and I'm going to start from the top and go down. As I move my cords down, I'm trying to move in a under-over sort of X pattern. So as I pull these down, I end up with kind of a set of X's on top as well as X's underneath. Now for our little bunny ear section here, we're going to break the pattern of over, under. We're actually going to go all the way down to these next ones here and then come out and in this set. So you want to end up with these little bars here at approximately wherever the waist is. And then we can go ahead and continue lacing up the rest of the corset. And now it's time to give it the very first try on to see if hopefully it fits like it should. So the benefit of the whole bunny ears method of lacing up a corset is that you can just pull on the ears here, kind of these little pair of loops, and then pull, pull, pull. This is the very, very first time that I'm lacing this one up, so everything feels very stiff. It is not broken in or like warmed up or in any way kind of molded to me very well yet. So also I did do some very small but definitely some changes to the design of this one, you know, altering it from the previous one, little things that I wanted to change up, and well, it feels different for sure, but I don't know how much of that is the pattern per se versus the broken-inness of the garment. I'll try and wear it a bit over the next couple days and see if it feels how I want it to feel or if there's any definite changes I want to make to it before finishing it off. So I've had a chance to wear it a bit more, and I also changed out the cording back here to something that was a lot less slippery than what I had before, which is perfect. It feels like it's holding the lacing panels much more evenly than it was before, and just feels more sturdy, which I'm glad of. Now, whenever I copied down the pattern from the previous one, I did make some small changes trying to improve upon the old pattern. Now that's always a process that's a bit fraught with potential peril, and one of the things I did was I made this back area a little bit bigger. I added like 1/4 of an inch to each of these kind of side back panels to help give me a little bit more room back there, and that in turn makes the whole top a little bit bigger. And I was worried when I first put this on that like, oh, I think the bust is way too big now. But I don't think that's actually what's happening. I think that you can kind of see like there's a bit of a flare out at the top here. And that's because I added an extra 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch to the top and the bottom in order to help get myself a little bit of a flexibility as I was sewing, because sometimes you don't line up panels super perfectly, even if you're trying really hard to match the waist marks. Sometimes you get a little bit of a jaunty sort of top edge. So it's nice to have a little extra, because then you can just trim all of it and it's even, beautiful, looks great. And I think that's actually what's causing this flare out, is because Victorian corsets usually end right at the mid bust. They don't go over like modern overbust corsets do. So I think what I need to do is just trim it back down. And I think that should get rid of the slightly weird fit at the very, very tippy top here. So next up, I'm going to do that trimming, I think on both the top and the bottom. The bottom maybe only like 1/4 of an inch, just to help neaten up this edge a little bit. For the top, I think I'm probably going to go down a full 1/2 inch at least to help it more properly end where it's supposed to for a Victorian corset. Then we can start binding. We can add extra little fabric to the very end here to make it all neat and tidy. So yeah, we're getting so close to done. And we are all done. I finished off the binding this morning. Now originally I was going to do bias binding, which seems to be what a lot of modern corsetry uses, but I took a really quick perusal on some museum websites for late 1800s corsets, and it seems like most of them are either separate tape, kind of like what I did on my old corset, where it's an applied separate, piece of trim on top, or if they're using the same fabric as the material of the corset itself, then they do a straight grain, so straight across rather than diagonally on the bias, which I'm not going to complain. That's a lot easier to do. I cut a strip about 1.25 inches or so wide, stitched it along the top and bottom, flipped it up, ironed it, flipped it again and again, and then top stitch it down, which means that the outside of the corset is extra beautiful and lovely. The inside is less cute to my eyes. I feel like other people are able to do this technique so much prettier than I am. I think it looks a lot nicer if you hand sew it down, but I don't want to. So machine it is. So while the corset is now functionally done, I could totally wear it and it'd be fantastic and wonderful. It is not quite fully aesthetically done. I have some decorations that I'm hoping to add to it, but I can't resist giving it another try on. I do want to check if that bust thing that I did ended up fixing the issue. I'm pretty sure it's fine, but I want to check just to be sure. And also, I have some new outfits that I want to try on thanks to the sponsor of today's video, ThreadUp. So let's try on a corset and some dresses. It looks like we are indeed well fixed in the bust area. It looks like it's no longer kind of jumping out as it was before. So let's try on some stuff. This feels really nice. ThreadUp is an online thrift store where you can get secondhand items, give them a new life, which is very handy for those of us who really love thrift shopping but don't exactly have a thrift store very close by anymore. Wrap dresses in particular work really, really well with corsets because they can, they come with their own belt and can really nicely conform to the shape of the corset or to just your own body. It's very like multi-use. Feels like it matches my decor, like with all the red, white, and green. I'm blending in with the plants. Very poison ivy. I feel so fancy. This is the one that I was most looking forward to trying on. It's got this really beautiful pattern on the skirt, and I just feel nice looking. The corset is in fact doing its job perfectly here. That bit where I made it go down just a little bit is because of this exactly. Not this dress particular, but I have a lot of dresses that seem to just a little bit dip right there, and so I wanted that kind of corner area of the corset to go down just a little bit, and that seems to have worked nicely. I mean, you can see my undershirt thing, but ignoring that, you cannot see the corset. I love this so much. Who's it by? Looks like the brand is Alex Evenings. Originally it was estimated $153 retail, but I got it for $28, and this is not bad. This one isn't an actual wrap dress, it's more of a faux wrap dress, but still very much achieves the look. I also got a little bit of outerwear for this winter season. I think it's very cool how even for things where you're not exactly expecting this to be super form-fitting per se, and therefore a corset shouldn't really make a difference, it has so much more structure and foundation with a corset underneath, much the same way that that provides for historical garments. I also got a cardigan, which, my goodness, that is hefty. It is from Bebe. ThreadUp's estimated retail was $95, but I got it for $18.90. Is this not super dang cute? I feel like if I'm ever wanting to do styles that are very like waist accentuating, like with my corseted styles, I like to wear sort of shorter tops with them, shorter overgarments. You know, I didn't intend this to be a like how to wear corsets with clothing session, but here we are. This is so cute. It feels very kind of Snow White, kind of 60s, kind of like a little capelet, but with sleeves. Part of what is very nifty about shopping on ThreadUp is that you can of course search for specific things like I want pants or I want wrap dresses or things like that. Or they have this feature that I used this time called, I think it's Thrift a Look, where there's pictures of looks that people have put together with ThreadUp pieces, or kind of just curated looks that have been made by the ThreadUp folks. And you can go in if a picture strikes a chord with you and shop for similar items. And because they're a type of thrift store, you're not going to see the exact same item, but instead you're going to get things that have a very similar feel, which is part of the adventure. It's part of the fun. And I saw several different looks that had kind of like cream sort of white sweaters with a nice, very chic fall winter look. And I did not know that I wanted myself a cream sweater, but here we are. And I could not be happier. The outfits also include things like accessories, which my purse is on its way out. So I was in the market for a new purse and I saw this one and thought it was super cute. I like basket-like purses. It is red on the inside. Whether you're shopping for your own corset-friendly styles or just want some nice new warm winter digs, check out ThreadUp with my link down in the description and make sure to use my code Morgan30 for an extra 30% off your first order. Now that we have given the corset a solid try and have verified that it fits really well under clothing, there's no weird lumps or bumps or anything, I think we are good to go for adding some pretty embellishment. One of the main pieces of embellishment that I'd like to do is lace along the top. That seems to be very, very common for late Victorian corsets. Sometimes they're super wide like this, sometimes they're narrower and the ruffly bit goes up, sometimes the ruffly bit goes down, sometimes it goes behind the top of the corset or on top. Like, you kind of have a lot of different options for what you can do here. I'm going to stitch along the top first since I want this top edge to really nicely follow along with the corset itself. And then I'm going to end up with some excess in some places like over the bust. And for there, it seems like a lot of them will kind of gently do folds as best they can to get it to look nice and sort of tack that down. So I'll play with that once this is on and see what I can do. All right, guys, I think I'm going to have to admit defeat on this. I stitched on that top edge like I said that I was going to, and the more I look at this, the more I just really don't like it. Which is a bummer, because like I like the lace separately off of the corset, but on I think it's just a little bit too stiff of a lace. It's too kind of big and does not want to mold and fold easily the way some of the laces I've worked with in the past have done. Like, I think this is just not the right lace for the project, and this is the only lace I have. So and I think I'm going to have to take it off and wait until sometime in the future some lace on a shelf jumps out at me and says that it is the one that's going to go on here in the future. But for now, I think we're going to go naked up top here. At least I can still do a little bit of the flossing with some silk thread that I've had in my stash here. It's just the right color, and I'm gonna try and just have fun looking at a bunch of museum examples, trying them on, kind of make this like a living sampler. JK, I should really stop saying things before I've done even a minute or two of research on them. It seems like most of the museum's examples are like very utilitarian, honestly. Not to say that there aren't probably many other examples, but the ones that I saw over and over and over and over again for the late 1800s seem to mostly be the ones that are the V or the slightly X'd V. But that's okay. That just means that it's going to be extra easy for me to do all the flossing on the corset. I do feel a little bit silly having just spent the morning being like, all right, here's the game plan, here's what I'm gonna do, and then doing some of it and going, no, never mind, JK guys. But sometimes that's how projects go. And honestly, I feel like projects are kind of filled with dozens and dozens of those moments where you try something and it doesn't quite fit right, doesn't quite look right, material's not right, and you gotta start over a little bit again and again and again, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that kind of thing. I am glad that I at least really like the base corset before I added on the lace. You know, if there's worse things in the world than just being happy with the plain version of your outfit or your costume. And honestly, with the lace being as bulky as it wasn't going to work very well under modern stuff anyway. I am mostly making this because I need it for historical wear, but I really enjoy wearing it with cute outfits modernly. Like, that's kind of like makeup, but for an outfit. You know, if you really just are in the mood to super duper dress up and you do your hair, you do your makeup, you put on a cute outfit, it feels to me very much like a lovely part of that. And so it's nice to have it be something that I can use, not just for historical stuff, but also modernly. Alrighty, I have removed the lace and I have a beautifully blank slate here for the flossing. Now, because I've decided to do kind of the more utilitarian late Victorian design with all the little V's, I think I will show you a few of them so that you get an idea of what the process looks like. But after that, I don't think you need to see me do all 3 dozen of them. So I will reserve this as my kind of fireside late evening activity while I'm watching my shows. And thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that you learned something cool about corsets and things. I hope that you had fun, and I also hope that you check out the sponsor of the video, ThreadUp. Go use my code Morgan for that 30% off your first purchase, and have a good day.